Newcastle RSL suffered extensive damage when the quake hit. Luckily at the time few people were in the building and no one was hurt. Fearing the remaining walls could fall, rescue workers called in the demolishers to finish off the job. While onlookers were kept at a distance, two huge cranes slowly pushed the facade of the club back into the earthquake rubble. A huge cloud of dust showered into King Street, leaving a pile of debris and just a memory of the old club. At Stockton, the bridge was closed for 2 hours while experts examined the crossing for damage. Earlier, a motorist called police after hitting a huge crack at the opening to the bridge. The break had been estimated at 10 centimetres, but tightened later in the day. By 2 o'clock, the road was reopened to traffic. Bill, what sort of damage is there to the bridge?
None to the bridge itself, slight subsidence of the approach embankment on this side.
Was it a good idea to block off the bridge just in case?
One never knows.
Royal Newcastle Hospital has asked that all staff report for normal rostered shifts tomorrow. The blood bank will be open to build up stocks for the weekend. Well, in just a moment, Prime Minister Hawke is in Newcastle tonight. We'll have a report on that. And also an inquiry into yesterday's fatal Tangara derailment.
Sydney was getting ready for morning tea when the earthquake arrived. 10 seconds of terror with an unmistakable ring of trouble.
Quite a large earth tremor, I would suggest.
Certainly was.
The floor started shaking and it was like being in an ocean on waves.
I sort of lost my balance a bit and my cup fell off the table and that was it, it stopped.
We thought the building was falling down.
We couldn't get out
quick enough.
25 floors up at Bondi Junction, radio man Stuart Cranny was on air, but the skyscraper shuffle wasn't on the playlist.
It was like broadcasting on top of a 25-storey pogo stick. It was mad, very, very scary.
It took out power right across the metro area. While hundreds of thousands of homes and shops temporarily lost supplies, few were damaged, to the amazement of their owners.
It shook bad enough for us to want to go outside in case a building fell down around us.
As the death toll rose, so did the thirst for news, and a special police hotline was soon swollen with callers.
As soon as we get the information, we'll get it back to you.
Radio talkback shows were also overrun. Everyone had a quake story they were anxious to share.
We had a couple of characters. One bloke was on the toilet and he thought the water board were going to send him up to Mars, I think. He got a bit of a shock.
At 5.5 on the Richter scale, it was technically a moderate earthquake, well down in the power league from this year's San Francisco tragedy, which at 7.1 killed more than 60 people. While our biggest earthquakes have happened in Western Australia, the most recent at Meckering registering 6.9, the Sydney region has suffered several moderate quakes, usually hitting hardest on the Kurrajong fault line.
It's not a single fault like the San Andreas fault in San Francisco. It's a group of faults and uplifts which run all the way from the Wollongong district, curve around to the southwest and west of Sydney and peter out as far as we can see them on the surface about where this earthquake seems to have been centred.
Tonight, the Prime Minister has arrived in Newcastle to survey the damage, and rescue workers have begun using infrared cameras and listening devices in the wreckage of the Workers' Club to locate survivors.
As mentioned, Prime Minister Bob Hawke is in Newcastle tonight, assessing firsthand the situation resulting from today's earthquake. He looked upset and anxious and brushed past the media, offering no comment, but speaking rather with Salvation Army officers at the scene. The Prime Minister sent this message earlier today. I would like to extend my deepest sympathy to the families and friends of those affected by the earthquake damage to the Workers' Club. The loss of life and the injuries of this appalling event are truly tragic, and the thoughts of all Australians will be with you and with all citizens of Newcastle.
Injuries in the early morning accident on board the Victorian competitor BP Flying Colours.
The damaged yacht limping toward the coast 12 hours after the tragedy. Still on board with the 12 surviving crew, the body of the dead sailor. Earlier, a rescue helicopter crewman was lowered onto the boat, but the rough seas made retrieving the body impossible.
The conditions were very trying due to the large swell and the tossing and pitching of the vessel. Winching from the aircraft was quite a difficult task.
Finally, docking in Eden, the men of BP Flying Colours could not hide their exhaustion.
Into the basement. Most of the vehicles were recovered, but 5 remained deep in a corner of the cellar under a slab of concrete. Also unaccounted for, 21 people. Rescuers believe they heard sounds coming from the rubble before dawn, but a cave rescue team sent into the tangled debris couldn't verify the report.
There's a lot of large machinery there, poker machines and a safe door, some toilet cubicles, but the site is a scene of absolute devastation inside there.
How far could you go?
We go right to the back of the building, but the slabs have fallen on top of each other in there, and there is a fair...
Was there any sign of anybody down there?
No, there's no sign of anybody alive that we could find. Our job was to go into the small spaces in between the slabs and on the brick walls to see if there was anybody trapped in small spaces that we could locate.
At the peak of this morning's rescue efforts, almost 300 personnel were on site, from police and ambulance officers to heavy machinery operators and volunteer rescue crews. State Coroner Kevin Waller was among the first officials to visit the Workers' Club. He expressed the bewilderment of so many Australians at the seemingly endless saga of tragedy.
It's yet another disaster. I'm soaking up the punishment at the moment. It just seems to be one disaster in New South Wales after another. But this one is even more astonishing, I think, than the others. So I've come up just to have a look, to satisfy myself with what's going on, to try and see what can be done in disaster situations, to gather as much information as we can to see how these things affect people. I'm afraid there's not much we can do to prevent future happenings, though.
So you'll be the first coroner in Australia, at least, to be investigating deaths from an earthquake.
Well, that's unfortunately true, yes.
Bishop of Newcastle, the Right Reverend Alfred Holland, reacted more personally to the earthquake aftermath.
I lost a son in a road accident when he was 17, so I can appreciate with some of the numbness and pain that people are in. But there's no answer to some of these questions that we have.
State Premier Nick Greiner and local ministers also inspected the clubhouse before continuing their tour of the devastated city. Shortly before 11 o'clock, rescuers faced a new peril. The adjoining waterboard depot was showing alarming movement in a brick wall facing onto the site. Engineers believed it would topple if heavy machinery was brought up to the debris. After a short conference, work on the club stopped as attention turned to the depot. Within an hour, excavators had all but obliterated the east side of the building. With time now so much against survival for anyone trapped in the club, work resumed at a punishing pace. Many involved in the operation had not taken a break since the quake, but they pushed on, always mindful of the danger, not only to themselves, but those possible survivors. After almost 30 hours' work by 260 personnel, the rescuers have broken into the basement tomb. It's been confirmed that bodies have been sighted down there. How many, we're not sure at this stage. However, work is continuing slowly as rescuers hope against hope they may still find survivors. At 4 o'clock, police rescue crews brought out 2 bodies, an elderly man and an elderly woman. But even as they carried those victims to the surface for placement at a temporary morgue, they were making preparations to return to the basement to free another body visible in the wreckage.
There are still a number of people that are unaccounted for, according to our records, and it'll be a matter of pulling the building to pieces and looking to see what we can find. Very shortly, the construction people are going to snip the roof off the building and topple a wall. And once that happens, the whole roof and western section of the building will fall, and we don't know what consequences it will have inside. So there will be nobody allowed in the building whilst this is going on. We have to take the roof out of the way. It is creating a danger for the rescuers, and once we get the roof out of the way, we alleviate our danger, we can start breaking the slabs up and going in underneath.
Even after their grim discoveries, rescuers are clinging to the faint hope of still finding survivors.
As we saw in San Francisco with the earthquake, there's always a chance, and we haven't given up hope at this stage.
The staff of the Newcastle Workers' Club met for the first time since the catastrophe at the Western Suburbs Leagues Club this afternoon. Although a day had passed since nature battered their workplace into chaos, those who lived through it still sat in shell-shocked silence. The club employs 150. 35 were at work yesterday morning, 4 in the Union Street side, the rest in the main entrance areas. One died when the concrete roof caved in, another is among the missing, feared dead. Secretary-Manager Wayne Dean says those who survived were heroic in their response.
Our staff worked very, very hard to get people out of the club quickly and safely, and they did an excellent job. They repeatedly came back into the club and got people out that were in difficulties. A lot of people managed to get out of the club by themselves. We were very lucky that not more people were hurt.
They risked their own lives by the sound of it.
Yes, some people did, because we do believe there were live wires. There was gas escaping. There was debris of a dangerous nature, and many of our staff were more than brave, I believe.
Although the western side of the Workers' Club continues to be transformed into a pile of rubble, the older eastern side apparently suffered minimal damage. Mr. Dean says they will rebuild.
We'll be able to work our way to setting up a new club. I can't at this stage indicate when this is going to happen, but we're working very steadily to clear the debris. That's a painstaking operation, and once that's done we can then look at demolishing the club, or part of the club that is been deemed as unsafe, and then we'll be able to determine what we can use of the remainder of the club.
Become eerie, completely silent and empty. Mel Kirsting, owner of a health food shop in the Hunter Mall, says while his shop didn't suffer structural damage, the quake will still be costly.
Yes.
How long do you think it's going to take to get over it?
Well, I don't think it could take a good 12 months or more, I would say, because I think that some of the structural damage has been done. Some of the buildings will have to be pulled down and rebuilt. It's just not safe enough for the people if we get aftershocks or another quake.
In King Street, one building swayed so much it dislodged up to 5 layers of bricks that now lay strewn over the footpath. A little further down the road, and staff were in moving everything out of the Hetherington Kingsbury Shipping Company offices. The western wall had clearly separated from the main body of the building overnight, and it was decided to risk moving around in the office to clear out expensive equipment and irreplaceable files. Brian Goddard from the shipping company says he has been contacted from ship captains and companies across the world concerned over the safety of the city.
Well, I have one here from a firm in Japan called Katanion, and they're very concerned about the considerable losses to our public facilities, and all their company are very anxious about the safety of the people in Newcastle. And I have a further one upstairs from Spain, expressing similar things.
Of course, there's ships off the port at the moment. They're also a little worried.
Yeah, that's right. I have a ship outside at the moment called the Leica, and he hasn't been able to get any information from the port at all. So he's very anxious, and hopefully we'll get him in tomorrow.
The Newcastle RSL Club 2 days ago, a proud freestanding historic building, was today a mere pile of rubble and broken pieces. Engineers and council officials have spent most of the day considering how to remove the debris without damaging surrounding buildings. The same concern is being expressed over the condition of the Great Northern Hotel that is leaning over the Tattersalls Club. Throughout the day, engineers have been taking measurements of the wall and are confident the hotel will have to be demolished to prevent it crushing the Tats Club. Across the road and the Customs House spire has shifted a massive 12 centimetres on its foundations. The wind vane atop the spire bears testimony to how violently the house shook, while the chimney now has extra drawing capacity. In Watt Street, and workers spent more than an hour dismantling a chimney that threatened to slide off the roof and onto the street. The dismantling was a slow process, as each brick had to be chiselled off by hand and dropped to the ground without causing more damage. Above the city, and Fletcher Park became a makeshift helipad for the military and visiting politicians who needed to land close to the city due to a blanket air ban over the business district and Hamilton. The 139-year-old obelisk that for so long sat above the city has also sustained serious damage and has shifted nearly a complete brick width. State Emergency Service personnel have been hard at work since the quake hit, many working through without more than 2 hours rest at a time. Their control centre below Fort Scratchley has received over 1,000 calls for help. Service personnel, along with Army engineers, have been inspecting houses throughout the area for structural damage and helping people to evacuate with a minimum of fuss. Service personnel have also been working to try and encourage homeowners to use less water, because water reticulation functions have been affected by the quake and are not at full capacity. SES coordinator Don Geddes says the last few hours have been hectic.
Extremely busy. As the day passes, there's more damage being found. Large buildings are moving on their foundations, and it appears that structural engineers may have to condemn some well-known sites in Newcastle.
What would happen then? Are we going to see immediate, probably, demolition of those buildings?
Well, to be safe, they would have to have demolition, or there would have to be major repairs carried out to meet the standards required by safety people.
Being so busy, have you called in for help from other areas?
We've got a lot of people helping. We've had Sydney SES people up. We've had people from the valley. We've had the Army helping. The Army was wonderful last night. They really worked hard, and so did the SES units from Sydney. Really worked hard for us.
What do you think the next 24 hours probably hold?
It's going to be a very busy time. People are going to start recognising more damage. More damage might become more pronounced, and as a result, people are going to start calling in. I think the best thing people can do, those who are not overly concerned with their damage, should start contacting their insurance companies and getting assessors to come out and have a look at it.
John, it seems the casualty list is endless.
Certainly does, just from small property to those injuries as well.
Amazing. Well, Newcastle faces a damage bill of more than $1 billion. Another report in just a moment.
Newcastle Technical College could face repair bills of $10 million.
The earthquake shook every building at the college, tearing down walls and shattering windows. The vibrations mixed volatile chemicals in a science laboratory, causing a massive fire. Today, as college officials and engineers inspected the damage, it became obvious the cost would be high.
I think that we would be looking at perhaps $10 million. It is a lot of damage. We have major buildings and a brand new building with the whole top walls have been damaged and are quite structurally unsound.
In this room alone, computer equipment worth in excess of $1 million has been badly knocked around by the quake. But from the tragedy, a semblance of good fortune. Had the quake struck during the school year, hundreds could have been killed. Here, bricks and glass poured down in an area normally filled with students taking morning tea. At the same time, staff normally sit in this courtyard. Despite the damage, Tech Management is hopeful work can begin soon on repairs, and next year's courses should go ahead as planned. Operations at the BHP are expected to return to normal within 24 hours. Yesterday's graphic pictures of flames and smoke pouring out of the steelworks happened after coke ovens were vented to the atmosphere after a power failure. The only major structural damage from the quake was a section of roofing collapsed in the steelmaking shop. Management says workers have handled the emergency well.
Last night, in fact, we made steel only 13 hours after the earthquake. But we do have some plant problems, but they'll take a little bit of time to restore all the cooling elements in our blast furnaces. But basically, nobody was hurt, our rolling mills are not affected, and customers won't be affected.
It is estimated that lost production and damages will cost BHP more than $1 million. But it's not just big business that's suffering with expensive repair bills. Average Novocastrians are feeling the pain as well. Here in Southern Street, Mayfield, 11 houses have major structural damage from the quake. 3 houses have been condemned.
Because it's come out that far, there's nothing you can do to re-put it back together again. You've got to demolish the whole wall. So we've had to evacuate the house.
The SES inspected homes in the street, warning people of the danger. One property condemned belonged to this man, Paul Banks.
Paul, how would you describe the damage to your house?
I'd describe it as chaotic. It's an absolute mess. All the money time we've put into it, it's just ruined.
Paul has spent hundreds of hours renovating the house, and just recently he put it up for sale.
Yeah, we had it on the market before it hit. It's going very cheap now, so anybody wants it, they can have it.
Meanwhile, the Salvation Army is preparing food packages for people forced to move from their homes. Local food companies have donated fruit and hundreds of cans and packages. The Salvo's initial job had been to feed rescue workers. Now, as the quake damages come to light, they have a bigger job.
So if people are in trouble, they need some food, they can get in contact with the Salvos?
That's right, yes. People would be having difficulty at the present time getting to our headquarters, which is on the corner of Union and Parry Streets. But I'm sure that if people were to go to the barricades and let people know of their need, that they would be let into us.
And as the post-quake clean-up continues, assessors are gaining some idea of the total cost of the disaster. Insurance claims are pouring in by their hundreds, and the Insurance Council of Australia has estimated damages could run up to $1.5 billion.
Yesterday is what insurance policies are all about. Many business people and householders more than paid off years of insurance premiums in that one 10-second shake. Surprisingly, perhaps, most standard insurance policies do include earthquake cover, although the insurance companies certainly didn't expect to have to honour that in Newcastle.
No, I guess we always look for a storm as being a problem in Newcastle, but certainly not an earthquake.
The major insurance companies have extended their office hours and have set up inquiry hotlines.
Well, the assessors are being appointed now. We're in the process of doing that today, and hopefully they'll be out first thing next week.
Staff have also been brought up from Sydney to help assess damage and process claims. AMP says its situation is typical.
As a lot of people are holding off from claiming on us because they think that a lot of people are in need, and their need is greater than some of our clients, which is very considerate of them.
The full cost of the damage will only become apparent with time. However, the figures involved are already enormous. AMP is preparing itself for payouts of more than $2.5 million to cover its clients in Beaumont Street alone, and it's not the biggest local insurer. Despite the massive figures involved, Stuart Sercombe says there's no chance the companies will run out of cash.
The main thing insurance companies do is watch for catastrophes, try and estimate where catastrophes might be, such as Newcastle, and where possible protect that by insuring themselves with other insurance companies, which evens out the cost to all the insurance companies and makes sure policyholders are protected.
Still to come, an emergency relief fund launched by Newcastle's Lord Mayor.
Why is the Delphos Group selling more new Nissans and quality used vehicles?
At 10:27 in the morning. In the centre of Newcastle, people's first reaction was to rush out of buildings which had swayed under the shockwave. Crowds milled in the streets, each person asking the same question: what happened? The city was brought to a standstill for a moment before the hushed silence was broken by the wail of sirens. The initial response by emergency services was complicated by a breakdown in their communication systems and telephones, and within minutes they were stretched to their limits. Calls for help often delivered in person. Newcastle Hospital was being evacuated. The Tyers Hill TAFE College was on fire. The Newcastle RSL was teetering on the verge of collapse. Buildings were extensively damaged at the junction. In Islington, many older buildings were shattered. Throughout Cooks Hill, terrace houses had been ripped apart. But although their disaster training had not considered an earthquake, emergency services very quickly marshalled their resources where they were most needed. In the coming days, the Newcastle Workers Club became the focus of attention. 9 bodies would be dragged from the twisted concrete and steel.
Both walls of the auditorium were waving like sails in the wind. And I looked up and I could see the material from the ceiling falling down, and the reason for that was that the roof was coming down as well as the ceiling and the chandeliers.
Howard Gibson has been a cleaner at the club for 22 years. He was in the main auditorium preparing for a big rock concert when the quake struck.
First of all, there's this terrible shaking, and then the ceiling material coming down and raining down like confetti. I first thought was to duck for cover, and because again you talk about 1 or 2 seconds, I suppose, and then of course this terrible fear of well, there's concrete coming down as well, you know, and bricks falling away and so forth. And I thought, well, this could well be it. I thought I might, you know, that my number was up.
Not much we can do.
The room just shook. Everybody got thrown onto the floor. It sounded like a big bang. And I thought, and then the shaking. And I thought, oh, it must be a bomb going off. And I asked one of the girls, and she said, there's a bomb going off.
She's all right. She's up that way.
She's up there. She's looking up there.
Straight ahead. There you go, sweetheart. Come with us. Is that all right? We'll get you something to put under your head. Sense to anybody? Right. Hemo, melon, sutton.
What was the other one? We had the Century Theatre at Broadmeadow.
Not Workers Club, the other club, RSL.
Yeah, the RSL at down in town, wasn't it? We had a roof collapse there, but hopefully there's nobody in there. They shouldn't be in there at this stage. They should have already got out. So we're hoping that situation is right, but I can't update you on it.
Would you say the Workers Club was the worst hit?
Well, I can't even tell you that. Honestly, I can't. But it seems to me that there was a lot of people who were in the club at the time, but exactly how many we don't know.
With the collapse of the support walls, the roof came crushing down. Like dominoes, the floors beneath collapsed under the weight. The concertina effect ended at the car park below. More than 50 ambulances were rushed to Newcastle from Sydney and the Central Coast. There was calm and a professional sense of duty amongst those rescue services personnel. With resources taxed to extremes not experienced before, Newcastle was lucky that this scene of human loss was not repeated elsewhere in the city. The grass median strip soon became a makeshift hospital, with doctors and nurses improvising with first aid. These were the kind of conditions usually reserved for a war zone. Leslie Irwin, a nurse at Royal Newcastle Hospital, was at home when she heard the news from a neighbour. For the first 4 hours, she was the only woman treating injured inside the rubble.
immediately all nurses are on call for any disaster, so I just threw my uniform on and went into town, and I went past the Workers' Club to see if it was true, and there were only a couple of ambulances there at the stage when I got there. So I yelled out to the fellow who seemed to be coordinating the services, and he asked me to stay and to go in and start helping with some of the people, because at that stage they were unaware of how many people were trapped and how many were hurt, and people from the actual employees of the Workers' Club were bringing people out, so it was difficult to gauge how many casualties there were at that stage. At first up, I went up the stairs to the ground level where the poker machines are, and we found one fellow alive there but trapped by his ankle, so we started an IV going in him to give him some fluids. So we were about halfway through getting him out, and he was fairly stable, and then they yelled out that they'd found 4 more people alive down in the rubble, I think in the car park or basement level. It was difficult to tell, it was all one. So we went down there and we found 3 people visible. Another girl was off to the left-hand side, hidden behind poker machines, but she was reasonable, and the 3 older people that we could see were really caught under a lot of rubble. It wasn't just bricks and debris, there was roof sections holding their legs and poker machines on some of the people, so we knew the task ahead was really going to be a long one.
It's just bedlam in there. It's it's just junk and concrete and everything everywhere. There was people everywhere, and just had to do what we could. We find each person as we came to them. There was people behind other people as well, so it was just a mess.
Warnings by earthquake experts that a severe aftershock could follow the quake hampered rescue operations for a short time.
Okay, well, I think at this stage we've got to keep away from the buildings. We've got to try and keep everybody out.
I believe there's a fear there's going to be a second tremor.
Yes, there is a possible. That is possible. We're taking precautions for that. I think what we've got to do now is to make sure people realise that they won't have time to run. This thing will hit, and you'll only have time to blink your eye. So they've got to move.
What stage have rescue operations reached now?
Well, the situation is that we've got a lot of people out. I've got a list here of all the people that we've got out so far. I'm just counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I got 13 people who've been taken out so far and are in a satisfactory condition. As far as I know, there is 1 possible dead, but not confirmed at this stage. And there is a lot of other people trapped. We don't know how many.
One of the most incredible entrap situations I've worked in, and to see those people the way they were there, hopelessly trapped under bricks, rubble and poker machines.
There was one elderly gentleman that we were working on that when we first got there, he was fully conscious. We just simply couldn't get his legs out, and unfortunately he bled to death while we were there. And there's another one very similar that we've just pulled out that's suffered a cardiac arrest. I don't know his status at the moment. He had, the elderly gentleman had such massive leg injuries that I doubt whether he would have survived. He just bled to death.
As rescue operations swung to roof level, emergency crews, construction workers, office staff and passers-by formed a human chain to clear a way, brick by brick, to those still trapped.
Big one.
Spread it out a bit if you like. Just spread it. Righto.
The Workers' Club was the scene of the greatest loss of life in the Newcastle quake, but damage was widespread throughout the city. At a time when demand for medical attention was at its highest, the hospitals did not escape structural damage. At Royal Newcastle Hospital, hundreds of patients were evacuated with fears that older buildings could tumble. Patients were treated under tents, pitched beside the beach. Newcastle's other major public hospital, the Mater Misericordia, suffered huge cracks to its brick walls. Patients were moved out. Those in intensive care were kept alive with emergency power generators. From the Mater Hospital, the huge Newcastle steelworks could be seen. Plumes of smoke poured into the air as the plant began an emergency shutdown procedure. Gases from the coke ovens were burnt off as the power blacked out. Early fears that there'd been an explosion at the plant were unfounded. The Technical College at Tyers Hill was hit by the full force of the quake. Chemicals in the laboratory wing ignited, causing a serious fire. Built on alluvial soil, the shockwave passed through the campus, crumbling buildings in its wake. Remarkably, although some 500,000 people were jolted by the quake, just 12 were to lose their lives, while some 100 were injured. The timing undoubtedly saved many. Schools were also closed for the summer vacation. There's no telling how many would have been injured or killed had these classrooms been full of children. Within hours of the quake, Prime Minister Hawke was inspecting the Workers' Club site, breaking his summer vacation and promising federal government assistance. State Premier Nick Greiner flew back from Hawaii. With more than 100 public buildings damaged in some way, his job was going to be a tough and expensive one in the months to follow. Late in the day, there was a subtle but important change in the approach taken by rescue workers. Cave experts, using heat-sensing devices, crawled amongst the wreckage in the hope that someone may still be found alive. Hopes quickly faded, and the rescue turned to demolition, an operation which went on around the clock. Stories of great courage and bravery always emerge after tragedy. Norm Duffy's quiet heroism was typical. He lay trapped in the Workers' Club for 5 hours before he was released. Despite massive injuries, he held the hands of 2 women lying nearby, offering comfort and support. Rescue workers have praised Norm for the way he held on as they worked to free him. Norm's wife of 38 years, Miriam, was killed by falling rubble.
Norm, you've gone through so much, yet you're still smiling. How do you manage to...
That's false, man. False. I'm trying to avoid that, the other thing, you know, till I get out. Get away from it.
Patrick Murray was a roadie, setting up for the rock concert scheduled for that evening. Had the quake struck during that concert, some 2,500 young people would have been in this auditorium, a situation almost too horrific to consider. Patrick rushed to a backstage room as the auditorium began to shake. Remembering the survivors of the San Francisco quake boosted his morale.
Thought about, you know, those people in San Francisco, how they survived in those cars all that time, so I decided just to relax, stay calm, and try and conserve as much energy as I could.
Mary Ironman was a regular of the club, enjoying a weekly game of Hoy. Arriving early, she was playing the pokies. Minutes later, she was lying dazed and trapped.
The trouble is you don't know whether you're going to be saved or not until you see the light where they are coming in. Because everything was piled up on top of you, everything was black. You know, having your life compared to the others that are gone, biggest jackpot in the world.
Runa McElwain was playing the poker machine next to Mary. 4 days later, she was sharing the hospital bed next to Mary.
I was just going to put some more 5 cents in after winning the jackpot. I was going to put some more into the machine. And it danced in front of me and all these bricks came from everywhere. And they all went under me and I fell back onto them. That's how I've fractured my spine.
Great relief also for Jacqueline Rowe, who was injured when the Kent Hotel awning in Beaumont Street collapsed on her and her 2 babies. She managed to push 10-month-old Alana to safety, but cries for help from 23-month-old PJ still haunt her.
I just kept screaming out for PJ, you know, like he was mum, mum. And I just kept screaming for someone to help me get him out. And then 5 young guys come along and they said, what's the matter? I said, look, my son's under all that. All I could see when he was there was this little boy laying on the ground with all this stuff over him. I thought he was dead. I'm still trying to forget it, but I can't do that. Especially when you've got a 23-month-old baby that nearly died from it.
While his mother may never forget those terrible moments, miraculously PJ escaped his ordeal virtually unscathed. This earthquake is different to others which hit Australia. The damage was recorded over an unusually wide area. 24 kilometres due west of the city centre, the township of Holmesville was rocked. No one was killed, but the stories of damage to buildings and broken dreams are typical of those experienced across the affected districts.
Just a lifetime of you see your kids when they were born flash in front of your face and the growing up stages. And when it's gone, how do you remember it?
Do you have any insurance?
We have no insurance at all, nothing. And my husband's and my age to try and restart and build from here, I don't know where we'll go. I've got no idea. We've got our ground and that's it. And I've got my kids and my family. That's the main thing.
Australia are a little like lightning. It's hard to predict where and when they will strike. One man studying exactly what happened is the head of the geology department at Newcastle University, Professor Ian Plimer.
What had happened was that the rocks in continental Australia have been taking up a lot of strain for a long period of time, and eventually the rocks will break, and that breakage was quite coincidentally under a highly populated area.
Why so much damage in Newcastle?
There are a number of reasons for that. The first reason was that it was a very, very shallow earthquake, really quite unusual. And the second thing was that a lot of the damage was due to the fact that the buildings in the Hamilton area were built on the old bed of the Hunter River. And when a shockwave goes through these unconsolidated sands, it accelerates, and so the buildings will suffer much more damage. In fact, the buildings close to the epicentre that didn't suffer much damage were built on rock, or built on areas under which there'd been mining, and the mining had taken all the stresses out of the rock, and these areas just didn't undergo enormous damage.
There are no seismograph stations in Newcastle. This was the last place one would expect an earthquake to strike. And yet history shows Newcastle has been hit by earthquakes many times before. In 1886 and 1925, quakes about 5 on the Richter scale were felt, but little damage was reported. Beth Chamberlain was just 9 years old, but remembers the quake of 1925.
The walls were moving, and I heard the rumbling underneath, and then my mother and my aunt raced in to see if I was all right. And it was a very scary experience, and I think that's what's made it stay in my mind for so long, because I've mentioned it many times over the years to different ones.
What did you think it was in the first occasion?
I didn't know, I suppose because I was too young. Really, it was just something you didn't know.
What about the amount of damage from that first quake? Was there much?
No, there wasn't any. It would be like a very severe tremor, I'd say, but nothing like this one.
The 1989 quake was the biggest this century on the east coast of Australia.
It's at least magnitude 5.5 on the Richter scale, and I would say that it was larger than the 1961 Robertson earthquake and the 1973 Picton earthquake,
Dr. David Denham heads the Bureau of Mineral Resources in Canberra.
The history of earthquake occurrence in southeast Australia is pretty irregular over the last 200 years. The first fleet was only ashore in Sydney by a month or so before they felt an earthquake. And in fact, several small earthquakes have been felt from time to time since that occasion.
The Newcastle quake was recorded at the Bureau Centre in Canberra. The parallel lines interrupted the telltale peaks. The centre records an earthquake like this one about once a year, somewhere on the east coast of Australia. About 500 strike each year around the world. But all the technical equipment available to scientists cannot predict when or where these quakes will next be felt.
Highly unlikely that Newcastle would have another earthquake. We have had sporadic earthquakes all through Australia. We have had something like 500 of these type of earthquakes every year in the world. The chances of Newcastle having another one are very slim for a number of reasons, that the area has already undergone a strain release, and the second thing is that these earthquakes just occur in a spotty pattern all over Australia. We've had similar major earthquakes in some of the underpopulated areas of Australia. It was just an unfortunate coincidence that it was in a populated area and very shallow.
An aftershock was recorded 10 minutes after the big one, although most people were too distracted to feel it. A second tremor was felt on the following evening. These shocks helped seismologists track down the epicentre, 13 kilometres under Cardiff, southwest of the city centre. The quake was some 10 kilometres beneath the deepest mine, so there were worries for the hundreds of miners working underground in the Hunter Valley's rich coal-producing districts. Instead of scenes of great devastation, scientists claim the coal mines actually helped Newcastle survive.
The fact that Newcastle has mines underneath it, in fact, made the damage a lot less, because the mining has reduced a lot of the stress out of the rocks, and that loss of stress meant that these rocks could actually take a lot of the earthquake energy. The second thing is that the mines are very, very well designed mechanically, and under normal conditions we don't get many rock falls, so it really made no effect at all to the underground mines. The underground mines have actually helped the city of Newcastle.
There was one instance, however, where the presence of coal mines created a subsidence problem of huge proportions. In the suburb of Bar Beach, a living room was literally sucked away. Indirectly, the quake was to blame.
Well, basically, you have an air shaft from an old mine working. That was, when it was completed, the mining there, it was capped with concrete. When the building was built over that, there was a concrete slab put over that. From what we understand, what's happened, water from the water table as a result of the earthquake has been pushed up. It's lifted that concrete plug and then it's sucked back down. And you can see from the damage around, and particularly out the front, that everything around the house and particularly in here has then been sucked in to the hole.
In the days that followed, thousands of tonnes of concrete were poured into the hole to try and cap the gaping chasm. But structural damage is now something thousands of building and homeowners are coming to terms with. Just why so many awnings in Newcastle collapsed can be explained in terms of structural engineering. It appears a council building code in 1928 ordered all support posts be removed, with concerns over increased car traffic on our roads. Tie support rods took their place.
The awnings were held back by tie rods. The tie rod was only fixed into the brickwork with a 4 to 6 inch diameter bolt only in the brickwork. Above that particular fixing point, typically it seemed that there was a parapet which was unstable due to lead flashing in it. And so when the shake came through, the brickwork above the flashing fell over onto the awning. The load of the brickwork on the awning pulled the bolt out of the tie rod, and hence the awning was then unstable and collapsed down into the street.
The aftershocks left a psychological impact on an expectant community much greater than any subsequent damage to buildings. Experts are divided on whether a quake can strike here again. Some believe that the occurrence of quakes clusters over time. Others believe another quake soon is unlikely.
The Earth is a bit like a tortoise shell with all the platelets moving, and they're either pulling apart in the mid-ocean ridge areas where we get earthquakes and volcanoes, or pushing together as we get, say, in Japan or New Zealand or Chile, and sometimes sliding past each other as we have in San Francisco. Australia sits in the middle of one of these plates, whereas in the western US we're getting a sliding motion. Now in the middle of the plates it's a very, very unusual phenomenon to get an earthquake. They are unpredictable and we don't know when they're going to happen and where they are, but they are really fairly minor. About 5% of the world's earthquakes occur within the plates. So it really is a very, very unusual geological feature.
Will you be prepared the next time the postman brings your cheque account statement? Will it be all you expect or perhaps a bit more? Account and transaction fees, state and federal tax, even low usage fees.
Important practical considerations. Which buildings had been left structurally unsafe? Which had to be demolished? Which could be repaired? Teams of demolishers moved in, changing the landscape in a matter of days. The junction motor inn, its back broken in the quake, was dramatically askew. Overnight, it was reduced to rubble. Today, all that remains is a vacant block. The inner city Newcastle RSL club suffered a roof collapse in the quake. Remarkably, no one was hurt. Hours later, the upstairs rooms would have been packed with patrons. It too was brought down. In a stroke of luck, the club had recently upgraded its insurance policy. In Broadmeadow, the best-known landmark, the former Century Theatre, was deemed beyond repair. The home of the Christian Revival Centre, the solid brick building was cleared to the ground. Just across the railway line, the Broadway Hotel suffered a similar fate. But while the demolitions were dramatic, the quake took its toll on many other buildings in varying degrees. In the city centre alone, this map shows the extent of that damage. The black buildings being demolished, the others suffering some kind of damage. An early count by Newcastle City Council shows 3,300 residential properties reporting damage, and more than 1,200 commercial properties also affected. Royal Newcastle Hospital's North and York wings were evacuated minutes after the quake. This put 200 hospital beds out of use. The York wing has been earmarked for demolition for some time. The North wing will be preserved for its heritage value, but will not be used again to treat patients.
There's no chance of using for health purposes the North and York wings again. They are irreparably damaged and $27 million short of current standards of refurbishment.
$6 million in damage was reported at the John Hunter Hospital under construction at Rankin Park. However, this will not affect the commissioning date of January 1991. The argument over preservation of old buildings surfaced as demolition crews started work on the George Hotel in Scott Street and the Carrington Chambers next door. The building owners had been told by engineers that both must come down. Conservation groups did not agree and wanted to save the buildings, but the argument of public safety won the day. Damage extended into the suburbs as well, with brick chimneys often the first casualty. Many homes lost parts of their roofs, some still covered only by tarpaulins put in place by the State Emergency Service. Volunteer crews answered more than 4,000 calls for help in the first weeks after the quake.
We had over a period of time about 1,500 SES personnel from Newcastle, Maitland, Upper Hunter and Sydney working to assist us. And most of those people worked shifts of about 48 hours and worked really hard. I think it's somewhat difficult for people to realise that there are people in the community who are prepared to work for nothing, and the response from the SES was in fact overwhelming.
A disaster relief centre was set up at Broadmeadow High School to provide food and shelter for those worst affected. Coordinated by the Department of Family and Community Services, this centre became a focal point for social care.
If anyone has their food vouchers, if you wish to go on the bus to Coles to collect your food, the bus is leaving in the next 5 minutes.
In the following 3 weeks, the centre processed 13,800 appeals for help. 300 families were made homeless. Another 1,500 had to find short-term accommodation until their homes were made safe. It's expected that 30,000 homes and businesses across the Newcastle district will be the subject of insurance claims. Repair costs are expected to be higher than those faced by Darwin after Cyclone Tracy. One of the first responses by authorities was to effectively close the city centre and Beaumont Street. Barricades were erected around dangerous buildings and roads were closed. Police and troops manned the blockades, allowing only those with special passes into the city. There was a rush on those passes when police announced they'd be handing them out to anyone who was eligible.
We've got to get in to Denison Street to get some finals.
Just got some identification?
Yep.
Our office is closed, so they have to get to Derby Street.
4 days after, the city fell silent. Images of a deserted Hunter Street on what should have been a busy day were reserved for those with access. Tempers were frayed as people realised how much of their city had been shut down.
One has to explain at every block why you're moving within the city. And it just feels a bit like you're a prisoner.
New Year's Eve was like no other experienced in Newcastle. Inner city residents shared the moment with newfound neighbours. Impromptu street parties were held on the closed roads. But for some, it meant a lonely vigil, bringing in the new year at work.
Yeah, Hamilton 10, just below National Airport, thank you. To the corner of Denison and Beaumont Street at Exchange Hotel. Do they want me to bring it to them or?
News of the Newcastle quake was beamed around Australia and around the world.
It was the first fatal earthquake ever in Australia. The quake registered 5.5 on the Richter scale. It was felt from Melbourne to Sydney. Hardest hit, the old steel mill city of Newcastle, about 75 miles north of Sydney and just a few miles east of the epicenter.
The epicenter of the quake, which measured 5.5 on the Richter scale, was just 18 kilometres west of Newcastle. The tremors, which lasted nearly a minute.
The quake hit at mid-morning, flattening dozens of buildings.
Of course, are still missing. The worst hit area, the city of Newcastle, about 75 miles north of Sydney. We have a live report now from John Church of NBN Television in Newcastle. John.
Thank you, Tricia. The situation here is that about 24 hours ago, an earthquake of the strength of 5.6 on the Richter scale struck this east coast city of Australia. Nobody expected an earthquake to hit Newcastle. There's no history.
Eastern Australia is recovering from a big earthquake tonight. That quake hit 5.5 on the Richter scale, and it was centered near Newcastle, 80 miles to the north of Sydney.
When Newcastle's Lord Mayor launched a special relief fund, money poured in. Already more than $3 million has been raised. This means the most needy victims of the quake will not do without. The spirit of the city was boosted in this time of need with the knowledge that the rest of Australia cared. Now Newcastle has begun the long process of rebuilding. Not only the many physical aspects, but the social and spiritual as well. Christchurch Cathedral, itself damaged by the quake, was the venue for a special service of commemoration and renewal. Candles were lit for those who died.
Newcastle people are tough and resilient. They are not strangers to hardship. And as a result of this earthquake, we will have the chance not only to recover, but to renew both ourselves and our community. And our suffering will strengthen our resolve to make for a better future.
The time-tested qualities of the people of Newcastle came to the fore with this earthquake. Rather than dwell on the problems, solutions are already being found. With many lessons learnt, Newcastle can be proud that its response to this disaster was swift and professional. The road to recovery is also full of promise. An optimistic vision for the future is shared by the people of Newcastle and the Lord Mayor, Alderman John McNaughton.
In the spirit of the community, we must make sure that people go forward with great confidence that they are part of a strong, caring, committed society. And that's what Newcastle always has been. It will take time, we require care, we require understanding, but we are going to do the job. And that is where the vision, my vision for the city is, where everybody knows that they're cared for. And with that, we have an absolutely incredible future.
It looks as though a bomb has hit. Bombs have hit all along here. It's like a war scene. People are standing around just dazed. There has been some loss of life, it appears, and buildings all up and down the street have just collapsed into the roadway.
From Newcastle there, and as we told you before, the ambulance service is sending all available vehicles, perhaps a fixed-wing aircraft as well, to the Hunter region, where there are reports of several injuries.
The room just shook. Everybody got thrown onto the floor. It sounded like a big bang. And I thought, and then the shaking. And I thought, oh, it must be a bomb going off. And I asked one of the girls and she said, there's a bomb going off.
It wasn't just bricks and debris. There was roof sections holding their legs and poker machines on some of the people. So we knew the task ahead was really going to be a long one.
People everywhere, and just had to do what we could, you know, find each person as we came to them. You know, there was people behind other people as well, so it was just a mess.
This has been a special NBN presentation. This headline news is brought to you by National Mutual.